"Control is the only thing a man like me can afford," the Duke once said. And for years Sebastian Blackthorne ruled his estate like a perfectly wound clock, every command obeyed, every door opened before he reached it, every servant silent. Before his presence the great halls of Blackthorne Manor breathed order, and nothing else, not warmth, not laughter, only discipline carved into stone and shadow. That morning, he stood at the head of the long oak table, a stack of documents before him, his gloved hand unmoving as the steward's voice trembled ever so slightly. "Your Grace, this will dismiss nearly half the staff." Sebastian did not look up. "The estate has no need for inefficiency." His signature cut across the parchment, clean, decisive, final. Outside the tall windows, gray clouds gathered low and heavy, pressing against the glass, like something waiting to be let in. One by one the servants were called, names spoken, fates sealed, footsteps fading down the marble corridor until silence reclaimed the hall, as it always did until it didn't. She was the last to be summoned. Eliza Whitmore stepped forward, her dress plain, her posture steady, not bowed, not trembling, not pleading. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, as if the weight of the room did not touch her. "You have been informed of the changes," Sebastian said, his voice low, controlled, like the distant roll of thunder. "Yes, Your Grace." Her answer was quiet, but clear. "Then you understand you are to leave with the others." A pause followed, not long but long enough to disrupt the rhythm he had built so carefully. "I understand the order," she said, "but I will not leave." The words did not rise, they did not challenge, they simply existed, and for the first time in years something in Sebastian's chest tightened, not anger, not yet something sharper, because no one refused him, not here, not ever. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers, expecting fear, expecting regret. He found neither, only stillness, the kind that did not beg for mercy, nor invite cruelty. "You presume too much," he said, each word precise. "I presume nothing, Your Grace," she replied. "I simply have nowhere else to go, and I will continue my work until you command me otherwise." The air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sebastian rose from his chair, the sound of wood against stone echoing through the empty hall. "You misunderstand me. I do not repeat commands, and yet you have not dismissed me." She set her eyes steady on his, not defiant, not submissive, something else entirely, something he could not name. Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating, and for the first time in years the Duke of Blackthorne felt something slip, not from his power but from his control, and he did not yet realize that this quiet girl standing before him would become the one thing in his world he could neither command nor escape. The silence did not break. When she spoke, it settled deeper, pressing against the walls of Blackthorne Manor like a weight that refused to move. Sebastian studied her as one would study a flaw in a perfect design, searching for weakness, for hesitation, for anything he could correct. But Eliza Whitmore did not shift beneath his gaze. She did not lower her eyes, nor did she tighten her hands in fear. She simply stood there as though his authority was something distant, something that did not quite reach her. "You remain only because I have not yet decided otherwise," he said at last, his voice colder, now sharpened by the unfamiliar edge in his thoughts. "Then I will remain until you do," she answered with the same quiet steadiness. Something in him recoiled, not from her words, but from the absence of resistance. He dismissed her with a flick of his hand, expecting her to retreat like the others, but she did not rush. She turned and walked from the hall at an even pace, her footsteps soft against the marble, as if she had all the time in the world, and for reasons he could not name. Sebastian watched until she disappeared beyond the corridor. That evening the storm arrived, without warning, wind striking the tall windows in sudden violent bursts, rain following in relentless sheets that blurred the world beyond the glass into a shifting gray void. Inside the manor the fire in the great hearth burned low, its warmth failing to reach the far corners of the room, where shadows gathered thick and unmoving. Sebastian stood alone near the window, one hand resting behind his back, the other curled loosely at his side. Control, he reminded himself, was not a matter of force, but of precision, of removing what did not belong, of maintaining order without exception. Yet as the storm deepened, his thoughts returned not to the estate, not to the dismissed staff, not even to the endless responsibilities that defined his days, but to a single moment, a single refusal that had slipped through his grasp like something alive. He turned sharply as the door opened without announcement, a breach of protocol so small yet so deliberate that it struck louder than thunder. Eliza stepped inside, carrying a simple tray, the faint scent of tea rising through the cool air. "You entered without permission," He said, his tone cutting the space between them. The kitchen fire was fading, she replied, setting the tray down with careful hands. I thought you might prefer something warm. He should have dismissed her again, should have corrected the breach, restored the order that had been unsettled since morning, yet he did not. Instead, he watched as she poured the tea, her movements unhurried, unafraid. The candlelight caught the edge of her face, softening nothing, yet revealing everything in the quiet lines of her expression. You assume much for someone in your position, he said. I assume nothing, Your Grace, she answered. I observed the storm rattled the windows again, louder this time, as if echoing the tension that neither of them named. Sebastian stepped closer, stopping just short of where she stood, the distance between them narrow enough to feel deliberate. You speak as though you are not bound by this house, he said softly. And you speak as though everything within it belongs to you, she replied, lifting her gaze to meet his. Something in his chest tightened again, sharper, now undeniable, because for the first time in years someone stood before him, not asking, not fearing, not yielding. And in that moment, as the storm pressed against the manor walls, Sebastian Blackthorne realized that control was not something slipping away. All at once, it was something unraveling thread by thread, and she had just taken hold of the first. The storm did not ease through the night. It deepened, pressing against the manor with a persistence that felt almost deliberate, as though the world beyond the walls had been stripped away, leaving only the dim corridors and the quiet tension that lingered between them. Sebastian did not sleep. He remained in his study, the fire reduced to glowing embers, casting long, unsteady shadows across the stone floor. A glass of untouched brandy resting near his hand, as if he had forgotten why he had poured it at all. Control, he reminded himself, was restored through distance, through silence, through removing the disruption before it could take root. And yet every attempt to return his thoughts to order led him back to her, not her defiance, not her words, but the absence of both. The way she stood, as if nothing he did could alter her presence, as if she existed outside the boundaries he had set for everything else. A soft sound reached him, not from the storm, but from the corridor beyond the study door. He stilled, listening. The manor had always been quiet. At night, every movement accounted for every step. Measured, but this was different, lighter, slower, almost careful. He rose without thinking, crossing the room in silence, and opening the door just enough to see the faint glow of candlelight moving through the darkness. Eliza walked alone, a small tray balanced in her hands, her figure outlined by the flicker of a single candle. The flame trembled with each step, yet she did not rush, as though the storm outside had no claim over her path. You wander where you should not. His voice cut through the corridor. Low and controlled, she stopped, but did not startle, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. The staff wing has lost heat, she said simply. Some of the rooms are too cold for sleep, so you take it upon yourself to correct it. He stepped forward, now the distance between them narrowing again. I take it upon myself to do what is necessary, she replied, and something in her tone made the word necessary feel heavier than it should have been. Sebastian's gaze shifted briefly to the tray, blankets folded with care, a small teapot, steam still rising faintly. She was not acting out of defiance, not seeking to challenge him. She was simply continuing, as if his earlier command had never truly reached her. You presume to remain, and now you presume to act, he said. You assume I act for you, she answered, lifting her eyes fully to his. The candlelight revealed the slightest weariness in her features, not weakness, but something quieter, something endured. The storm rattled the windows again, louder this time, the wind pressing through unseen gaps in the ancient walls, and for a brief moment the candle flickered low, nearly extinguished. She shielded it with her hand instinctively, protecting the small, fragile light from the force outside. Sebastian watched the motion, something about it striking deeper than it should have, because she did not protect herself, she protected the light. When the flame steadied, she lowered her hand and continued, without waiting for dismissal, moving past him, as though the corridor belonged to neither of them. He did not stop her, he did not speak, he only turned slightly, following the quiet rhythm of her steps as she disappeared into the darkness beyond. And for the first time in years, Sebastian Blackthorne stood in the center of his own manor and felt something unfamiliar settle beneath his carefully ordered thoughts. Not anger, not authority, but the quiet and dangerous realization that there were things within his walls he did not understand, and worse, things he could not command. Morning came slowly to Blackthorne Manor, the storm retreating only enough to leave the sky heavy and colorless, as if the world itself had not fully decided to return. Sebastian had not slept. The fire in his study long since burned to ash, yet he remained standing where the night had left him, his thoughts no longer moving with the sharp precision he relied upon, but circling something quieter, something unresolved. Control required clarity, and clarity required distance, and yet distance had become impossible the moment she refused to leave. The corridors stirred earlier than usual, footsteps echoing in uneven patterns, voices low, uncertain. The absence of half the staff had changed the rhythm of the house in ways even he had not anticipated. Inefficiency, he had called it weakness, he had removed, but what remained now felt less like order and more like something hollow. He moved through the manor without announcement, his presence once enough to still every motion, now meeting only delayed reactions as those who remained struggled to fill the spaces left behind. When he entered the west wing, he found her again, not where she was assigned, not where she was expected. Eliza knelt beside the hearth in a small, unused sitting room, coaxing a reluctant flame back to life, the wood damp from the night air. Her sleeves rolled just enough to reveal hands marked not by luxury, but by work. Steady, patient, she did not look up when he stepped inside, as though she had already sensed him there. "This room is not in use," he said. "The fire will be now," she answered, simply adjusting the logs until the flame caught stronger, casting a faint warmth into the cold space. He watched her for a moment, longer than necessary, longer than he would have allowed. "Before you act without instruction," he said. "I act because instruction has not come," she replied, rising to her feet and turning to face him fully. The daylight revealed more than the candlelight had the night before, the quiet exhaustion at the edges of her eyes, the calm that did not fracture even under his scrutiny. "You were dismissed," he reminded her. "And yet I remained," she said, not as a challenge, but as a fact, the kind that did not bend to authority. Something in him tightened again, sharper this time, not confusion, but resistance. "You remain because I allow it," he said, his voice lower, now more deliberate. "Then dismiss me," she replied, the words landing with a quiet certainty that unsettled more than defiance ever could. The room seemed to still around them, the small fire crackling softly between silence and sound. Sebastian held her gaze, waiting for the flicker of doubt, the hesitation that would restore the balance. He understood, but it did not come. Instead, she stood exactly as she had the day before, exactly as she had the night before, unchanged, unmoved, and for the first time, he realized it was not that she defied him, it was that she did not measure herself by him at all. Outside, a faint breeze shifted, the last remnants of the storm brushing against the windows like a whisper that something had passed, yet something else had begun. "You would choose to leave if I ordered it," he said finally, not as a command, but as a question. She studied him, then not his title, not his authority, but him, as if searching for something beneath it all. "I would choose to leave if there were something worth returning to," she answered. And in that moment, something within Sebastian Blackthorne shifted, not broken, not yet, but no longer untouched, because control had always been built on certainty, and she had just taken that from him. Without raising her voice, without asking permission, without even trying, the words lingered long after she spoke them, settling into the walls of the room as though they had always belonged there. Sebastian did not respond, not immediately, because there was nothing in his carefully constructed world that accounted for a choice like hers, not fear, not obligation, not survival, something worth returning to. The phrase repeated in his mind, quieter each time, yet more disruptive with every echo. He turned away, first a small motion, almost imperceptible, but final enough to end the moment, or at least to pretend it had ended. "You will report to the main hall at noon," he said, his voice steady, once more restored to its usual control. "There are adjustments to be made. The estate does not function on uncertainty." She inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as though his command existed alongside her decision rather than above it, and then she stepped back, allowing space to form between them once again. By the time the clock struck 12, the manor had shifted into a strained imitation of order. Fewer footsteps echoed along the corridors. Conversations were shorter, movements more deliberate, as if every person remaining had become aware of the fragile balance holding the estate together. Sebastian stood at the center of the great hall, issuing instructions with precision, assigning duties, redistributing responsibilities, correcting inefficiencies before they could take root. His voice carried clearly across the marble floors, each word measured, each command final. And yet, even as the system reformed around him, something remained uneven, a subtle disruption he could not eliminate, because it was not in the structure, it was in the awareness That someone within it did not bend. Eliza stood among the others, not at the front, not hidden at the edges, simply present, her attention fixed not on him, but on the tasks as they were assigned. When her name was called, she stepped forward without hesitation. The West Wing requires constant attention, he said. Fewer staff means greater discipline. You will oversee the rooms, ensure they remain usable. She met his gaze briefly before answering. I will ensure they remain lived, and the distinction was small. Yet it struck with quiet force. The hall fell silent for a moment, too brief for anyone else to notice, but long enough for him to feel the shift again. You will follow the instructions given, he said, and I will complete what is necessary, she replied, neither yielding, neither raising their voice. And then it passed, the moment folding back into routine as he moved on to the next name, the next command, the next attempt to restore the order he had always relied upon. Hours later, the manor settled into a new rhythm, one that functioned but did not flow. Sebastian walked the corridors alone, as he often did, observing without being seen, noting each detail, each adjustment, each imperfection that required correction. The West Wing should have been the least stable, yet as he entered it, he found something unexpected. The rooms were not merely maintained, they were warm. The fires lit, the curtains drawn back, the air no longer carrying the cold emptiness that had defined the space before. It was not perfect, not controlled, but it was alive. He stopped in the doorway of one of the sitting rooms, watching as Eliza moved quietly across the space, adjusting a chair, placing a book where it could be reached, not for display, not for order, but for use. She did not notice him at first, and in that moment, he saw something he had not accounted for, not defiance, not obedience, but intention, the kind that did not ask permission to exist. When she finally turned and saw him, she did not startle, she did not pause, she simply met his gaze as though his presence changed nothing. You altered the function of the room, he said. You altered the people within it, she replied. The fire crackled softly between them, the warmth filling the space in a way his commands never had. And for the first time, Sebastian Blackthorne realized that control could create structure, but it could not create life, and the difference between the two was beginning to matter more than he was prepared to admit. The warmth in the West Wing should have felt like a correction, an improvement, something he had ordered into existence. Yet as Sebastian stood in the doorway, he knew it was not his doing. The fire burned steadily, the air carried a quiet sense of presence. Not the rigid stillness he preferred, but something softer, something that lingered after movement ended. You believe this is better, he said, his voice low, measured. Eliza did not turn immediately. She finished adjusting the curtain, letting it fall into place before answering. I believe it is lived in. The distinction again, simple, yet deliberate. He stepped further into the room, his gaze moving across the details he would have once dismissed as unnecessary. A chair angled toward the fire rather than aligned against the wall, a blanket folded within reach, not hidden away for order, but offered for use. You create comfort where discipline should exist, he said, and you create discipline where comfort is needed, she replied, finally, facing him fully. There was no challenge in her tone, no attempt to oppose him, only the quiet certainty that had begun to unsettle him more than any argument could. Outside, the storm had passed, but the sky remained pale and distant, the light filtering through the windows thin and uncertain, as if the day itself had not fully committed to returning. Sebastian moved closer, stopping just short of where the warmth reached him, as though crossing that final step required more than intention. It required acceptance of something he had not yet named. You assume the estate requires this, he said. I do not assume, she answered. I observe the people who remain, the ones who still move through these halls as if they are waiting for something to change, something to return, and you believe that is your responsibility, he asked, not quite a challenge, not quite a question. She held his gaze for a moment longer before answering. I believe if something is within reach, it should not be left untouched. The words settled between them heavier than they should have been, because they were not about the room, not about the fire, not about the small adjustments that had brought life back into a forgotten space. They were about choice, about action, about stepping beyond the boundaries he had spent years reinforcing. Sebastian's jaw tightened, slightly, not from anger, but from the slow realization that she was not simply altering the environment, she was altering the balance itself. You were not instructed to take on such decisions, he said. I was not instructed to ignore them either, she replied. The quiet defiance in her words was not loud, not sharp, but it remained steady, unwavering. And that steadiness was what made it impossible to dismiss. A faint sound echoed from the corridor beyond, hurried footsteps, followed by a voice calling softly for assistance. Sebastian turned instinctively toward the doorway, his expression shifting back into the control. He understood, but Eliza had already moved past him, her pace calm, but purposeful as she stepped into the hall. He followed a moment later, not out of command, but out of something less defined, less certain. The source of the disturbance revealed itself quickly. A young maid stood near the stairwell, her hands trembling slightly as she struggled to steady a tray that threatened to slip. The absence of guidance, the strain of reduced staff, had left her uncertain, unsure. Eliza approached first, her voice gentle but clear. "Take a breath," she said, placing her hand lightly beneath the tray to steady it. The girl exhaled shakily, her shoulders easing as the tension left her grip. "You are not expected to carry it all at once," Eliza continued, adjusting the balance until it rested secure again. Sebastian watched the exchange in silence. Something about the simplicity of it, the ease with which Eliza restored not order, but confidence, unsettled him more than any disruption. Had the girl nodded her thanks before continuing down the corridor, her steps steadier now, more certain. When Eliza turned back, she found Sebastian watching her, not as a duke assessing a servant, but as a man observing something he did not yet understand. "You intervene where it is not required," he said. "And you withhold where it is," she replied. The words landed softly, yet they carried a weight that lingered long after they were spoken. And in that moment, as the quiet of the corridor returned, Sebastian Blackthorne realized that control was not the only force shaping his world anymore. And the presence of something else, something quieter, but far more enduring, was beginning to take its place. The corridor fell quiet after the young maid disappeared, her footsteps fading into the distant rhythm of the manor. But the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not empty. It carried something unresolved, something that refused to settle. Sebastian remained where he stood, his gaze fixed on Eliza, as though the moment had not yet concluded, as though there was something more that needed to be said. But neither of them spoke. First, the firelight from the nearby room stretched faintly into the hall, catching along the edges of stone and shadow. "You interfere without permission," he said finally, his voice steady, yet lacking the sharpness it once held. "I respond when something requires it," she replied, her tone unchanged, her posture still composed, as if the conversation itself held no weight for her. And yet it did for him, more than it should have, more than he could easily dismiss. "You place yourself where you do not belong," he continued, stepping closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to define the distance. "Then tell me where I belong," she answered without hesitation. The words did not challenge him, they simply existed, waiting for an answer. He did not immediately have. The question lingered between them, heavier than any defiance, because it demanded something beyond authority. It demanded understanding, and that was not something he offered easily, or at all. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze narrowing, as if searching for a response that would restore the order he relied upon. "You belong where you are placed," he said. At last, the words, familiar, structured, correct. Eliza held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "Then perhaps you have not yet decided where that is." The quiet certainty in her voice did not rise, it did not press, it simply settled into the space between them and remained. Something shifted again, subtle, yet undeniable, not in the manner, not in the structure he controlled, but in the foundation beneath it, the part he had never questioned because it had always been absolute. Until now, the sound of distant bells marked the passing of the hour, low and steady, echoing through the halls. As the day moved forward, whether he commanded it or not, Sebastian turned slightly, breaking the moment, not because it was resolved, but because it could not continue without revealing something he was not prepared to face. "Yet there is still work to be done," he said, his voice returning to its usual form, more controlled, more distant. Eliza inclined her head in acknowledgement, as she had before, as she always did when the conversation reached its quiet end. But this time, she did not move immediately. Instead, she stepped past him, her presence close enough that he felt the subtle shift of air, the quiet warmth that followed her movement through the cold corridor. He did not turn to watch her leave, not at once, but when he did, she was already halfway down the hall, her steps, even her pace, unhurried, as though she moved by her own measure, not his. And for a brief moment, something unfamiliar pressed against his thoughts, not frustration, not command, but something quieter, something that lingered long after she was gone. Later that evening, the manor settled again into its altered rhythm. Fires burned where they had not before. Voices carried softly where silence once ruled. And in the center of it all, Sebastian Blackthorne stood in the grand hall, alone, his gaze moving across the space he had shaped for years. Every detail, once precise, every movement, once predictable, And yet now there were changes small, almost imperceptible, but present in every corner. He could correct them. He could restore the structure, remove the influence that had begun to spread. But he did not move. Instead, he remained where he was, the weight of that choice settling deeper than any command he had ever given, because for the first time he was not certain which version of his world he intended to preserve, and that uncertainty lingered longer than it should have, long enough to become something far more dangerous than disorder. It became possibility. The night settled differently, this time not with the hollow quiet that had once defined Blackthorn Manor, but with a softer presence that moved through its halls like a breath, not yet fully understood. Sebastian stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hand resting lightly against the carved railing, his gaze drifting across the dim glow of candlelight that now lingered longer than it used to. The manor was changing, not in structure, not in stone, but in something far less tangible, something that did not obey command, and yet existed all the same. Below him, a faint sound broke the stillness, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady. He followed it without announcing himself, his steps measured, as always, though the purpose behind them felt less defined. The West Wing again, he realized, not with irritation, but with something quieter, something closer to expectation. The door to the sitting room stood slightly open, a narrow line of warm light spilling into the corridor. He paused just outside, not entering, not yet inside. Eliza sat near the fire, her posture composed, but no longer in motion. A book rested loosely in her hands, though her eyes were not on the page, they were fixed on the flame itself, as if the quiet flicker held more weight than the words. She had chosen not to read. The room was still, not empty, not silent, but full in a way he could not fully account for. "You remain here often," he said at last, his voice breaking the fragile calm. She did not startle, she did not rise, she simply closed the book gently before answering. "It is one of the few places that still feels real." The answer did not fit the space as he understood it, and yet it lingered there, undeniable. He stepped inside, now the warmth reaching him more fully than before, the air softer, the edges of the room less defined by shadow. "You speak as though the rest of this house is not." She lifted her gaze, then meeting his with that same steady calm. "The rest of the house feels arranged." This feels lived in. The fire shifted slightly, a quiet crackle echoing between them, as though marking the space her words had created. Sebastian moved closer, without realizing it, his attention no longer divided between observation and control, but fixed entirely on her and what she represented. "You have altered more than rooms," he said, his tone lower now, less command, more recognition. She held his gaze for a moment longer before answering. "Perhaps the rooms were never the issue." The simplicity of it unsettled him, not because it challenged his authority, but because it bypassed it entirely, reaching something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to consider. The manor had always been his responsibility, his structure, his control, but it had never been his question until now. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows, no longer violent, no longer demanding, only present, a reminder that something beyond the walls continued, whether he acknowledged it or not. "Why do you remain?" he asked, the question quiet but deliberate, not a command, not an expectation, but something else, something closer to need. Eliza did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting briefly toward the fire before returning to him. "Because leaving would change nothing," she said, "and staying might." The words settled into him heavier than anything she had said before, because they carried choice, not obligation, not circumstance, but intention, something he had long since removed from his own life in favor of certainty. And yet here it was standing before him, calm, unwavering, impossible. To ignore the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with something fragile, something that had not yet taken form but had already begun to exist. And in that moment, as the firelight flickered between them, Sebastian Blackthorn realized that control had never been the absence of weakness, it had been the avoidance of it. And for the first time, he was no longer certain. He wanted to avoid it at all. The fire had burned lower by the time the silence between them finally shifted, not broken, but reshaped into something quieter, something that did not demand words yet refused to fade. Sebastian did not move immediately. He remained where he stood, the distance between them unchanged, yet no longer defined by authority alone. The question he had asked lingered still, not because it required an answer, but because it had already given him one. "You believe staying will change something," he said at last, his voice softer than before, not uncertain, but no longer absolute. Eliza did not look away. She held his gaze with that same calm presence that had begun to feel less like defiance and more like truth. I believe change happens whether we allow it or not, she replied. The difference is whether we choose to be part of it. The words settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as an invitation, one he had not been offered in years. Perhaps ever. Sebastian's hand tightened slightly at his side, not in anger, but in resistance, the kind that came from recognizing something he was not prepared to accept. Yet you speak as though choice is a privilege, he said. For most it is not. She tilted her head slightly, considering his words before answering. It is not a privilege, it is a risk. The fire cracked softly, the sound small, but clear in the stillness of the room, as if marking the weight of what had just been said. Risk was not something he embraced, it was something he eliminated, something he removed from every decision, every structure, every aspect of the world he had built. And yet here it was again, standing before him in the form of a quiet woman who refused to be shaped by his certainty. What risk do you take by remaining? He asked, his tone deliberate, now more focused than before. Eliza's gaze shifted briefly to the fire, then back to him, as if measuring the answer. Before giving it, I remain where I am not needed, she said. I speak where I am not asked. I stay in a place that has no reason to keep me. Her voice did not rise, it did not waver, but something beneath it carried a weight that had not been there before. And that is a risk, he pressed. It is, when you have already learned what it means to be unwanted. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, but they struck deeper than anything she had said before, because they revealed something not through explanation, but through absence. The absence of fear, the absence of expectation, the absence of anything that could be taken from her, because she had already lost it. Sebastian's breath stilled, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it. The shift in his own control, the slight fracture in the distance he had maintained between himself and everything else. You speak as though you have nothing left to lose, he said quietly. Eliza did not respond immediately, and in that silence something in him tightened, not from impatience, but from something closer to anticipation. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, not weaker, but more honest. Perhaps that is why I am not afraid of staying. The firelight flickered again, casting a brief shadow across her face, and for a moment he saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough to understand that whatever she carried, it was not something she would offer easily, not something he could command or uncover by force. Outside, the night remained still, the storm long gone, yet its presence lingered in the quiet tension of the air, as if something had passed, but something else had taken its place. Sebastian took a step closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to feel the warmth of the fire reach him fully, enough to feel the shift within himself become undeniable. You believe this place can change, he said, not as a challenge, not even as a question, but as a recognition. Eliza met his gaze once more, her expression unchanged, yet her answer carrying something new, something steady, something certain. I believe people can. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the quiet understanding that something had already begun, and for the first time Sebastian Blackthorne realized that the greatest risk in his world was not losing control, it was allowing something to matter enough that control no longer felt like protection, but like a barrier. He was no longer sure he wanted to keep the silence after her words did not fade. It deepened, settling into the walls of the room, as though it had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Sebastian did not move, his gaze fixed on her, not as a duke measuring a servant, but as a man standing before something he could not reduce to order. You believe people can change, he repeated quietly, not because he doubted her, but because the idea itself felt unfamiliar in his world. Change implied instability, risk, uncertainty, everything he had spent years eliminating. Eliza did not look away. I believe they do when they stop pretending they are not already different. The fire shifted again, its light unsteady for a brief moment, before settling back into a steady glow, as if mirroring the tension between them. Sebastian exhaled slowly, the motion subtle, controlled, yet carrying a weight he did not fully understand. And what do you believe I am pretending? He asked the question. Deliberate, but not sharp, not a command, but something closer to curiosity, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Eliza studied him, then not his title, not the authority that surrounded him, but the man beneath it, the one he had kept hidden even from himself. That you are untouched, she said simply, that nothing within this place reaches you, that you stand apart from it all. The words did not accuse, they revealed, and in doing so they unsettled more than any defiance ever could. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from the quiet recognition that she had seen something he had not intended to show. You assume too much, he said, though the words lacked their usual certainty. Perhaps, she replied, but you have not denied it. The air between them shifted again, heavier, now not with conflict, but with something closer to truth, the kind that could not be dismissed once it had been spoken. Outside the manor, the night stretched on, silent and still, the last traces of the storm long gone, yet its presence lingered in the cold edges of the windows, a reminder that something had already passed, something that could not be undone. Sebastian took another step closer, the distance between them narrowing, not enough to breach the boundary entirely, but enough to feel the warmth of the fire against his skin, enough to feel the change within himself become something he could no longer ignore. You speak of change as though it is inevitable, he said quietly. It is, she answered, just as steady, just as certain, whether we resist it or not. Her gaze did not waver, and for a moment neither did his. The space between them filled not with words, but with the quiet understanding that something had already begun, not in the manner, not in the structure he controlled, but within him, and that realization carried a weight far greater than any command he had ever given. Then why remain here? He asked again, the question softer, now not seeking an answer, but needing one. Eliza's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, something that carried both distance and presence at once. Because leaving would be easier, she said, and easy has never changed anything. The words settled into him, heavier than anything she had said before, because they did not challenge him. They reflected something he had always known, but never acknowledged. Control had been easy, distance had been easy, detachment had been easy, but none of it had ever altered what remained beneath it. Sebastian looked at her, then truly looked, not as a duke assessing, not as a man commanding, but as someone beginning to understand that the world he had built was no longer the only one that existed, and that the quiet woman standing before him had already begun to change something he had believed unchangeable. The fire burned steadily between them, its warmth no longer confined to the room, but extending into something far less tangible, something that did not obey structure, did not require permission. And in that moment, as the silence settled once more, Sebastian Blackthorne realized that control was no longer the foundation of his world, it was the barrier between what he had been and what he was slowly becoming. And for the first time, he was no longer certain he wanted that barrier to remain. The silence did not end when the words were spoken. It stretched between them, deeper, now heavier, as though something unseen had shifted into place and refused to move. Sebastian did not step back. He did not restore the distance he had always relied upon. Instead, he remained where he was, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, close enough to feel the presence of her, in a way that no longer felt accidental. You believe ease is the enemy of change, he said quietly, the words slower now, less controlled, not because he had lost authority, but because he was no longer certain it applied here. Eliza did not look away. Ease allows us to remain the same, she answered, and sameness has never protected anyone. The simplicity of her words struck deeper than argument, because they did not attempt to persuade. They revealed something already understood, something already known, and for the first time Sebastian did not move to correct it. The firelight shifted, casting a softer glow across the room, and in that light something in her expression became clearer, not weakness, not vulnerability, but something carried quietly over time, something that did not demand to be seen, yet could not be hidden entirely. You speak as though you have already faced what others avoid, he said, his voice lower, now not interrogating, but observing. Eliza's gaze flickered briefly, not away, but inward, as if the answer existed somewhere beyond the room, beyond the manor, beyond the moment, before returning to him. I speak as someone who learned that waiting changes nothing. The words settled with a quiet weight, not dramatic, not heavy, but undeniable, and something in him responded not with resistance, but with recognition, because he too had waited once long ago, waited for something to shift, for something to return, for something to matter again. And when it had not, he had replaced waiting with control, built a world where nothing unexpected could reach him, where nothing uncertain could take hold. And yet here it was again, standing before him, not loud, not forceful, but steady enough to remain. You believe staying here is not waiting, he said. It is choosing, she replied. The distinction was small, but it altered everything, because waiting was passive. Waiting required nothing. Choosing required risk, required acceptance of consequence, required something he had long since removed from his life. The room fell quiet again, not empty, but full of something neither of them named. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows, a reminder that the world beyond continued unchanged, while within something entirely different was unfolding. Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on her longer than before, longer than necessary, as if committing something to memory, though he could not yet define what that something was. "You do not ask for permission," he said at last, not as a reprimand but as a realization. Eliza's expression did not shift. "I do not ask for what I know will not be given." The words did not accuse, they acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, something within him shifted again, not breaking, not collapsing, but bending in a way he had not allowed in years, because she was not asking him to change, she was not demanding anything at all, she was simply existing in a way that made his control feel less like strength and more like absence. A long, quiet moment passed before Sebastian finally spoke again, his voice lower, now steadier, but no longer untouched. "Then perhaps I have not been offering what is needed." The admission was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried more weight than any command he had given, because it was not spoken as a duke, it was spoken as something else, something closer to truth. Eliza studied him for a moment, not with surprise, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding that felt more unsettling than either. "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps it was never yours to offer at all." The fire crackled between them, the sound small, but clear. And in that moment, Sebastian Blackthorne realized that the control he had built his entire world upon was not something she intended to take from him. It was something he was beginning to question on his own. And that question, once formed, could not be undone. It could only grow. The words did not leave him. When she spoke them, they remained steady and unmoving, as though they had found something within him that had been waiting. Without his knowledge, Sebastian did not respond immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because every answer he had once relied upon no longer seemed sufficient. "Perhaps it was never yours to offer." The sentence repeated in his mind, quieter each time, yet more present with every passing second. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that no longer felt cold, but uncertain, as if the room itself had shifted into something unfamiliar. "You speak as though I have no place in what happens here," he said at last, his voice controlled, but no longer distant. Eliza did not step back. She did not close the space between them. She simply remained exactly where she was. "You have a place," she answered. "You simply stand outside of it." The distinction was subtle, yet it struck with quiet force, because it did not deny his presence, it redefined it. Sebastian's gaze narrowed slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because she was not removing his authority, she was revealing its limits. And for the first time, those limits did not feel like strength, they felt like separation. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, its warmth constant, now no longer fighting against the cold, but existing beside it, as though the two could remain without conflict. "You believe I have chosen distance," he said quietly. "I believe you have chosen safety," she replied. The word lingered heavier than it should have, because it carried something deeper than comfort, something closer to fear, though she did not name it, and neither did he. Not yet. Safety had always been his foundation, the absence of uncertainty, the removal of risk, the assurance that nothing beyond his control could reach him. And yet, standing there in that moment, it no longer felt like protection, it felt like absence. "You mistake control for safety," he said, his tone lower, now more deliberate. "I do not mistake it," she answered. "I understand why it exists." The calm certainty in her voice did not challenge him, it acknowledged something he had never spoken aloud, something he had buried beneath years of discipline and order, because control had not been born from strength, it had been born from loss. From the moment he had learned that what mattered could be taken without warning, without reason, without return, and since then he had built a world where nothing could reach him in that way again. But now, standing before her, that world felt incomplete, not broken, not wrong, but insufficient. In a way, he could no longer ignore. The silence stretched again, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, something neither of them forced into words. Outside the manor, the night had softened, the air no longer sharp with the remnants of the storm, but quiet, almost still, as if waiting for something within the walls to resolve. Sebastian's breath slowed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for him to feel the shift, the change in the way he stood, the way he remained, without stepping back, without restoring the distance he had always chosen. "You believe I stand outside of this place," he said, "and yet you remain within it." Eliza's gaze held his steady, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "I remain because I know what it is to be left outside," she said softly, "and I will not do the same to others." The words carried more than meaning, they carried memory, not spoken, not explained, but felt in the quiet weight beneath them, and something within him responded. Not with resistance, but with understanding, because he had done the same, not outwardly, not intentionally, but in the way he had shaped his world, in the way he had removed connection, in the way he had allowed nothing to reach him, and in doing so had left everything else outside. The fire burned steadily between them, its warmth no longer something separate, but something shared, not through intention, but through presence. And in that moment, Sebastian Blackthorn realized that control had never truly protected him. It had only kept him apart, and the quiet woman standing before him had just shown him a world where distance was not strength, and for the first time, he did not step away from that realization. He remained within it. The fire burned low. By the time the silence settled into something final, not empty, not uncertain, but complete in a way neither of them had expected, Sebastian did not step back. He did not restore the distance he had once relied upon. Instead, he remained where he was, the warmth of the room, no longer something he observed, but something he stood within, as if for the first time he had allowed himself to belong to the space he had spent years controlling. Eliza did not move, either her presence steady, her gaze calm, yet no longer distant, the space between them unchanged, yet no longer defined by separation alone. You believe distance was never strength, he said quietly, the words no longer framed as resistance, but as understanding. Eliza held his gaze. It was protection, she answered, but protection can become a wall. The simplicity of it carried no accusation, no blame, only truth. And in that truth, something within him finally shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because he recognized it not as loss, not as weakness, but as clarity. The manor around them had changed. He could feel it in the softened echoes of footsteps, in the warmth that lingered where there had once been none, in the quiet presence that moved through the halls, not as order, but as life. And for the first time, he understood that it was not something taken from him. It was something he had never allowed to exist before. You remained when you had no reason to, he said, his voice lower, now more human than command. Eliza's expression softened, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him, because leaving would have meant nothing, she replied, and staying meant something might. The words did not echo, they did not demand attention, but they settled into him with a weight that felt different from everything that had come before, not heavy, not burdensome, but grounding, as if something within him had found a place to rest for the first time in years. Sebastian looked at her, not as a duke, not as a man who controlled everything within these walls, but as someone who had begun to understand what it meant to stand within them rather than above them. You changed this place, he said quietly, not as a question, not as an accusation, but as recognition. Eliza shook her head slightly. No, she said, I only stopped it from remaining unchanged. The distinction was small, yet it carried everything, because she had not forced anything, she had not demanded anything. She had simply existed in a way that allowed something else to grow, something he had never permitted before. The fire flickered once more, its light steady, its warmth constant, no longer fragile, no longer fighting to exist, but simply there, as if it had always belonged. And in that moment, Sebastian Blackthorn understood something he had spent years avoiding. Control had never made him untouchable, it had only made him alone, and the quiet woman standing before him had not taken that control from him. She had shown him that he no longer needed it. In the same way, he took a slow breath, the motion deliberate, the shift within him quiet, but complete. Then remain, he said the words simple, yet carrying more meaning than any command he had ever given, not as permission, not as authority, but as something else, something chosen. Eliza did not bow, she did not thank him, she simply nodded, as if the decision had never truly been his to grant. And yet in that moment it did not matter, because for the first time Sebastian was not standing apart from the choice, he was part of it. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with something steady, something enduring, something that did not require control to exist. And as the fire burned on, and the manor settled into its new rhythm, Sebastian Blackthorn remained where he was, no longer untouched, no longer separate, but no longer alone. And in that quiet, unspoken shift, he understood that weakness had never been something to fear. It had been the beginning of something he had never allowed himself to feel until now, and it was no longer something he intended to turn away from.